Hey everybody, Payments Professor here, and today's Payments Podium is really special because we're going to have a real professor on. Now, a lot of you probably know I'm not a real professor. It's just really good branding. That's what the Payments Professor is. But today I have a real professor on. I've got Cathy Mansfield. And Cathy, would you introduce yourself and tell us what kind of professor you are?
Yes. So I have been a law professor for a long time, and I specialize in consumer protection. I also teach contracts and payments law and some other related areas.
All right, so consumer protection and payments law. I get questions about this all the time, and people are like, so there's laws that are really there just for consumers and payments, electronic payments? Can you give us like a high level, what are those laws or those regulations?
Sure. So, up until the 1970s, really, there weren't a whole lot of consumer protection laws, but there was this really big push in the 70s, both at the federal level and the state level, to kind of overlay common law, contract law, just us forming a contract with some protections that consumers needed. So, consumer law covers everything from disclosures when you take out a loan, like the Truth in Lending Act, to how your mortgage is serviced, to how debt collectors are permitted to interact with you, and what kinds of lawsuits they can bring and stuff like that. To how do you fix something on your credit report? What if you open your credit report and some others, child support debt is on your credit report and it's not your kid, that kind of thing. State consumer protection laws have restrictions on like door to door sales and on what kind of form a car sales contract has to be in. There's warranties when you buy a car, so payday loans, so it's a huge area.
Okay, this is a growing list. I'm thinking
Yes,
I
it
need to
is.
take notes because you're a professor and I'm a professor known for quizzes. You're a real professor with good tests. That's a
Yes, there will
lot.
be a test. There will be a test at the end.
Oh my gosh. Okay, everybody pay attention, take good notes. So now, payments laws and some ones you mentioned that especially came around in the 70s, I think the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, which, in our industry, in the payments industry, we usually just refer to as Regulation E. What exactly, or, high level for the quiz that we'll get right, what is Regulation E?
Yeah, so I just actually wrote a law review article on this. So if anybody's interested, it's Michigan Journal of Law Reform. It's called "It Takes a Thief and a Bank," which is about fraud on P2P systems like Zelle. But before Reg E, most payments were paper, right? You would write a check or you'd pay cash, and those were your options. And there's always been laws, very complicated laws, about processing checks and writing checks. And the basic theme is, if there's a bad guy who steals something, they're responsible. But if you can't find them, the first person to deal with them is responsible. So, like a bank that banks a thief would be the one that would be liable if you can't find the thief. So, you get to the 1970s and they come out with these doohickeys called ATM debit cards, which were slow to catch on for good reason. And I remember the first time my parents pulled into one of those ATM things. It might not have even been drive up then, stuck the card in, you'd say a little prayer that it didn't eat your card and that the cash would actually come out. And actually, they were outside at first and they were really susceptible to weather. So they broke all the time. So it took a while for the payment system to even catch on. But once it did, it was the only electronic payment system for a really long time. So EFTA, the Electronic Funds Transfers Act, which is a federal statute, was passed to give consumers protection in the electronic payment systems environment, which back then were these ATM machines where you could get cash and you could maybe do a couple point of sale transactions. And that was it.
So it started off in the 70s, really just protecting my ATM card more than anything else. And I
Yeah,
also
and that
know, really, I guess it was more later in the 70s, mid 70s to 80s, we saw ACH come about. Now, it wasn't really popular in the 70s, but it got popular in the 80s and took off in the 90s and hasn't stopped. And that's an electronic payment, if I understand correctly, that also is covered under Regulation E.
Yeah, so and just to clarify, so EFTA is a federal statute and Regulation E is the regulation that was written pursuant to the statute, and they both govern electronic transactions with consumers. The Federal Reserve Board had the regulatory authority until the CFPB was created, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and now the CFPB does Reg E. So one of the things, I'm jumping ahead to now, but one of the things that you see discussed frequently now is who has the authority to adapt Reg E to the current electronic payment system, which we'll get to eventually. But yeah, ACH came online, and to the extent that consumer transactions, my pay, my if I pay someone through my online banking and it runs through the ACH rails, those are still consumer transactions that are subject to Regulation E.
So Reg E is covering my debit cards. It's also covering, does it cover my credit cards? Does it cover anything else besides ACH and debit cards?
No, that's a great question. So it doesn't cover credit cards, also kind of an accident of history. But the Truth in Lending Act is the statute that covers credit cards. And I always tell consumers, if you have an option to pay with a debit card or a credit card, you're much better off paying with a credit card because the fraud protection's better using a credit card. The repayment rules are better. So if I call my credit card company and I tell them that there's been a transaction that I didn't authorize, basically that's taken off my balance while it's worked out. With EFTA, the Electronic Funds Transfers Act and Regulation E, there is a timetable for the bank to investigate, but they don't have to recredit the money right away. And so if you're someone who's living on a slim edge financially, having something come out of your account and then having to wait while the dispute gets resolved is a problem. And then we're always hearing about financial institutions that just don't, you call and say this was unauthorized and they don't investigate. So you may not even get an investigation, even though you should.
See, okay, that's something that a lot of the followers of the payments podium actually ask about is why don't I get my money back right away? If somebody's, done something to my account, they'll ask me, well, hey, payments professor, this happened to my account. Somebody took money out. I didn't authorize it. And my bank is telling me they don't have to give me my money for a couple of days. Is that actually true?
Well, so here's the thing. Sort of proceeding with like the order of things. So EFTA hasn't changed at all, teeny tiny bit since the 1970s, and neither has Reg E. And the definition of an unauthorized transaction was adopted in the environment of those dinky little ATM machines getting rained on, and that was it, right? So the definition of unauthorized transaction under EFTA is very much stuck in the mind frame of, okay, I give my kid my debit card, that's authorized. I tell my kid I want it back and they don't give it to me, that's maybe authorized still because I actually gave them access to my account. Someone defrauds me into giving them my debit card, that is actually unauthorized. But if someone defrauds me into sending them money, that right now that's arguably authorized. So the way that unauthorized and authorized are defined under EFTA is very much because of the payment environment in the 70s, and it hasn't adapted at all to these new payment systems, including payment systems like Zelle and PayPal and things that are running through instant rails and that are irrevocable. And so I think you see Congress starting to take a look at that. CFPB is taking a look at it. But right now we're kind of stuck in this sort of, this happens a lot with payments where the industry is and the payment system is so far ahead of the laws that there's this like mismatch.
Oh, okay. I have so much I want to ask and say right now because you're so right. I have to tell people all the time is we a lot of times have innovation, but we don't have regulation to cover that innovation. So we've got the case right now of I agree we are at a point of innovation is strong, but regulation is still trying to catch up. And one of the things that comments you made too earlier was that CFPB does Reg E. In other words, what you mean by that, if I'm correct, is the CFPB is the one that controls changes and amendments to the growth of Reg E. And you also mentioned how Reg E, with things like Zelle and PayPal and the instant. And the question I get a lot is if it's a consumer payment made via FedNow or RTP, the two popular instant payment rails, Does
Mhm.
Reg E apply?
Reg E definitely applies. The question is whether the particular transaction is authorized or unauthorized. And the type of unauthorized transactions that are getting a lot of press play and that are really hurting a lot of people are ones where you get a text, it looks like it's from your bank, you do what you think is the responsible thing and respond, and it turns out it's a very sophisticated scam where you are actually transferring money yourself, you're hitting send out of your own bank account and it goes to a thief. And that's something that was never in the I mean, cell phones weren't even in the contemplation of the Congress that wrote EFTA. So the problem is that any federal agency can only do what Congress gives it authority to do. And so I have some sympathy for the CFPB being kind of stuck with this statute that is really old. And so, certainly a clearer fix would be for Congress to take a look at this and decide. I mean, it's really just a policy choice. Who's going to bear the losses of these kinds of frauds, right? Is it going to be consumers, or is it going to be the bank that banks the thief, or is it going to be a closed system like PayPal that lets all comers in, or who's going to bear those losses?
I love how you just put that because it's not an easy fix. And I've had people say, well, the bank should always pay for it. And I explained to them, if the bank always pays for it, the bank can't make money. And then they eventually get to a point where they can't even offer it to you because it
Yeah,
becomes such
I
a
mean,
loss for them.
that is true. Although when you look at executive salaries at banks, my heart doesn't bleed too
Not
much.
too much.
Is that a salary I'd like to have? Absolutely. But there. The other half of this article I wrote talks about KYC, or know your customer,
Mm-hmm.
controls that can help with this. So, in order to get a payment on Zelle, you have to have a bank account. And so, someone is banking that crook, usually the same bank where the victim's account is. And that is a failure, as far as I'm concerned, of know your customer rules and Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering rules. So, there's, you know, I think there also has to be sort of a slicing and dicing of the blame pie, if you will. So
Mm-hmm.
I just had my credit card stolen about 3 months ago.
Oh no.
My number, not my card.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a text from Chase that said, "Did you just buy $200 worth of goods at Dick's Sporting Goods?" And I was out for a hike, and I was like, no. um, if that text had come from a fraudster, it would have looked very similar. So, that's a really hard fraud to resist. We always tell people, and the banks are telling their customers, never respond to a text from us. You know, get off the phone and call us at the number that's, listed as our real number. But I can tell you, I was out for this hike. I got this text and I just texted back no. And if they had texted back, you need to click this link and send us $100, I would have known, no, 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 no. But I mean, I do this for a living. So yeah,
Well,
I have
and
a
I
lot of.
get that too because I I do really feel for people. And there was a point in time earlier in my career, I was like, why are people doing this? You should know, you should know. But we have that expert bias. And I have
Mhm.
stopped and realized too, I have come close to clicking links I shouldn't have. Very
Yep.
dangerously close in a couple of situations. And that's with the knowledge and understanding. So I'm a big fan of having the consumer protection. And I love that you mentioned too, maybe Congress should get involved. I agree. And I do believe too that the financial institutions, they need to apply, KYC. They need to apply friction is what I call it. Have some friction in place to make the payment a level of difficulty that the person really wants to send it and understands what they're doing, but not too hard that they can't send it. But I
Right.
also think there needs to be more education.
I think that not no one thing is the magic bullet. There needs to be education, but it can't be the only thing. And so, I think Congress 2 years ago introduced a bill. It was called like the Electronic Payments Protection Act or something like that. That of course died with that Congress. But I've heard talk that it may be revived, and it definitely needs legislative attention. The other thing that needs attention is wires are right now considered to be excluded from EFTA. And I don't know if you've ever bought a house, or a car, but consumers do use wires and are required to use wires. And those are governed by UCC Article 4A, which is a state law that was never meant to protect consumers. And so, one of the other things this proposed legislation in Congress did was it brought consumer wires into the protection of EFTA. I hate sending wires. When I bought my house, I was so afraid of, making a number mistake and that, there goes my down payment. And it's not like I can do that twice, right? So I think the answer is multivariate. I I also think, and I talk about this in the article. We have all this financial information protection which we need, but right now, if a financial institution is suspicious that a customer is using their account to commit fraud, um, they can file a suspicious activity report with FinCEN, but there's really limited information sharing permitted between institutions. And so, one of the things I talk about in the article, and I'm not the only one who's had this idea, is like if you and I go apply for credit, we have a credit report, right? And there ought to be something that banks can access that says, oh, yeah, this is, John Smith. He's been unbanked at 5 major institutions for committing fraud. You're going to be much more careful about letting him open an account at your institution. Right now, that information isn't available anywhere.
Yeah, so more like a banking history. What's your banking history look like? Because you're right, we got so much on credit history. We should be able to have something on banking history as well.
And we need to cover mules too, because then people will just stop using themselves as the person that applies for the account.
Well, yeah, and then for those of you listening, a mule is basically somebody who's got an account set up that it's set up in a name that's not really them. They're posing
Right.
as somebody else. And there's a little bit of identity theft that's taken place, or there's a situation where somebody's collecting money on behalf of somebody else and doesn't realize it's for fraudulent reasons.
And actually, it's sometimes tied to human trafficking too, that
Mhm.
tied to human trafficking, that, someone will get a bunch of people through human trafficking and then use them as mules. So it's a very big issue. And of course, the other side of that coin is that we're seeing a lot of people being unbanked who really haven't committed fraud. And so information would help with that. There's a lot of people who are just sent a notice from their bank that they've discovered something odd about them and they close their account and hold their money for a while until the account's actually closed, and that's a problem on the other end of the spectrum.
I keep getting so many questions. Like, for example, when you mentioned the wires, I too am hesitant to send wires. In fact, one of the reasons I'm such a fan of Fed Now is it's so similar to how a wire works, but it does give the consumer protection. And it works in a manner that's so much faster that you have, I want to say, more transparency and understanding of what's taken place than that wire where I send it and just hope and pray that it's gone through. So do you think that maybe having Fed Now and or these instant payments can replace some of the things that wires are doing?
I suppose it could, but you know, you still have some of the characteristics of a wire that are frightening, which include irrevocability and instantaneous. And then it has to become part of the industry. Like so as far as I know, real estate deposits are still they're using wires. And the industry, it's not like I could tell my closing agent that I didn't want to wire the money. I actually tried that. I was like, "Can I bring you a certified check?" And they were like, "Nope." So, it has to become a payment that the people you're paying will agree to receive.
Hey, maybe we need to get Congress to get involved in the real estate agency to help fix this.
Maybe, or the real estate title and closing industry. RESPA does, there's another federal statute that does govern that, but not that aspect of it.
Okay. And another thing that came up in wires is you mentioned UCC 4A. Now, one of the things when I'm training, working with people, is I always tell them if you hear UCC 4A, immediate think business, not consumer, but business transactions taking place. So is that correct? That when we see UCC 4A, we're probably talking a business transaction, not a consumer.
Usually, but it has to do with what payment system you use, not who's using it. Whereas EFTA is who's using it, but the regulation to EFTA excludes wires. So that's why UCC 4A governs a wire even when right now, even when a consumer is making the payment. Um, I should say quickly just about UCC 4A. So the UCC stands for Uniform Commercial Code. This is going to start sounding like my class here for 2 seconds. But the Uniform Commercial Code is a uniform law that gets proposed to the 50 states. And so there are actually 50 versions of UCC 4A. And they should be similar because most state legislatures will just adopt the uniform law whole hog, but they don't have to. So when we're talking about UCC 4A, we're really talking about Arizona statutory law and Ohio statutory law and Florida statutory law, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, we got high level there for a minute. And
Sorry.
one of the things as a payments experts, like for those who are taking an AAP exam, you know that ACH typically uses the state of New York unless otherwise stated, which makes it even more fun and confusing, right? Now here, I got to tell you, I don't actually watch TV that much. People who know me know I rarely turn on TV. If I do, it's usually because I'm watching a lightning hockey game or I'm a big race car fan, some F1 NASCAR type racing. And I actually turned the TV on a couple weeks ago, and there was a news article that was on that was talking about there was a small business that was on the news that was upset that their bank wouldn't give them their money back. And the bank started, or the newscaster started saying, Reg E should be giving them all this protection. And I'm sitting here going, no, they're a business. I understand. And they showed it from the perspective of these are consumers. But I'm like, no, 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 no. You said they did this as a business. So my whole point being is I see where there's a lot of confusion. And if you are a small business operator out there, would you agree that people need to understand this is why you have separate accounts? One is your personal account where you have your consumer protection. The other is your business account, which does not have the consumer protection. And that's more UCC 4A. And you should be monitoring it even more regularly.
Right. So that's exactly right. So the Electronic Funds Transfers Act does not apply to business accounts. Now, do small businesses need some protection? Probably. Should a small business owner be segregating their funds? That's a requirement of having corporate status or LLC status, or so you can't you're not supposed to mingle your funds. If you have a bank account, so if you're wiring 4A would apply, but if you're writing checks, then just UCC Articles 3 and 4 apply. And this is one of the things that I've thought about writing an article about for years. Is in some ways this whole business where credit cards work this way and debit cards work this way, and it depends if you wire, and if you don't wire, you're with UCC. And if the check, we haven't talked about this yet, if the check, you write a check and it gets converted to an electronic image, that can be processed as an image, which is check 21, which is a federal statute, or it can be translated into an electronic transaction. Then it's hybrid. And do we really know which law applies? I mean, this is ridiculous, right? I mean, it's great for lawyers. It keeps us all employed. But, wouldn't it be better if we had a unitary system?
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm with you, though. I tell people that you want a good career in electronic banking, you go either in the regulatory or fraud side. You'll never be without a job because it's just constantly changing and evolving, and there's so much work to do.
The other thing I wanted to say too is that you see, like, as there's all this fraud right now that's getting all this attention on Zelle and all these other, on Venmo and all these other systems, Cash App. What started to happen is we're seeing more check fraud. So if you have all these different ways of regulating, it's like you squeeze here and a bubble pops out there. And regular garden variety check fraud has been around forever, and that's old UCC law, which is a very complicated system for assigning liability.
Well, I agree with you too. Actually, I hear people complain about, the electronic payments fraud, and I'm like, what's your check fraud look like? And in most situations, it's twice as bad. Check fraud is the king of fraud right now. It's so bad. But I want to go a little bit different as we wrap up things here. And one more area I really want to hit on, and I want to congratulate you because I know you just got made a board member of the FPC, the Faster Payments Council. And what I would like to ask, again, congratulations, is what is it you think you'll be able to do with the FPC? Your point of view, coming in from the consumer protection side of things, what is it you envision being able to offer being part of that organization?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So actually, I've been on the board for 6 years, I think. So I'm on my third term. There's a 2-term limit unless there aren't enough people to serve. And so the board voted to allow me to continue. I represent the National Consumer Law Center on the board. And I think one of the really great things about the way the Faster Payments Council is structured is that there was a recognition that you would get the best, most high quality discussions if you have everybody at the table, including consumers. And so I feel very strongly that consumers need to have a voice. And I think what I've ended up bringing to the FPC is kind of like, I don't know, like a dog who sits quietly until a squirrel runs by and then I bark, you know? So I know that's kind of a weird analogy, but like I look at everything and I check for errors and I check for a perspective that's missing. Um, and I say something about it. And so, for example, we just issued a frequently asked questions about electronic payments. And there was a little bit about 4A and there was a little bit about all these federal statutes, but there was nothing about EFTA. And I said, hold on, you need to have something about EFTA here. And so that's kind of how I've perceived my role. And for me personally, it's been great because I don't know that much about operations. And so I've learned a lot participating on the FPC. And I've gotten to meet people like you, which is great.
Yeah, meeting has been great. And I got to tell you, the main thing I just got out of this is you helped me to be able to describe the role I serve at Pigeon, which I do some work with a third-party service provider. And I am exactly that. I am that dog that sits quietly until I see something going wrong. And then I bark and go, you can't do that. Or there's a rule or there's a regulation that says we can't do that. So thank you for that. A lot of things that we've gotten out of today is you've helped us to understand Reg E, what it is. I would tell everybody, go look for that article. You said Michigan Journal of Law. It takes a thief in a bank. I'll try and put a link up for that too to be able to get people to
Journal of Law Reform.
Law Reform. Thank you, Michigan Journal of Law Reform. We got a better understanding of UCCA versus Reg E, what the CFPB does. One thing is, if people want to get a hold of you, I believe it would be your professor page at Case Western. Is that correct?
Yeah, Case Western Reserve University Law School, and if you go to the faculty, I'm listed, and you can get to me through there.
Excellent. And we also got to promote a little bit of the Faster Payments Council. Anybody who's looking to learn more about faster payments, go there. It is a great resource. Of course, I'm always here to be able to help and serve you. If there is somebody you think should be on the payments podium, or maybe there's a topic you'd like to have discussed on the payments podium, like this very topic came from many requests of you out there, you can always email me, kevin@paymentsprofessor.com. I will do my best to make sure that we get, like in this case, a real professor to be able to tell you what's going on. But other than that, for today, I got to say, class dismissed.